Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, alumni, and friends. It's my pleasure as Dean of the SOAS College of Law to welcome you to this important event tonight. Tonight's event is more than a formal occasion in our academic calendar. It's a reflection of who we are as a university and what we stand for. At SOAS, the study of law has always been inseparable from questions of justice, power, and global responsibility. It's a commitment to asking hard questions about the law and bringing law to bear with enduring legacies of history. We don't approach the law as a closed system of rules, but as a living set of instruments that shapes and is sharpened by struggles for dignity and equality across the world. Tonight, the Center for Palestine Studies annual lecture will be given by esteemed Professor Ussama Makdisi and is titled History, Gaza, and the Question of Genocide. I'll leave it to my colleague, Dr. Nimer Sultany, chair of the Center for Palestine Studies, to introduce this evening's speaker. Before I hand it over to Nimer, I want to first commend the Center for Palestine Studies, its chair, its members, its advisory board, for their tireless work over the years to inform the community about Palestine, bringing together scholars, lawyers, doctors, UN officials, activists, artists, and other prominent voices to consider the implications of what's happening in Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine on international law, concepts of rights, and thinking through how we do justice to the past in contemporary times. From running an annual graduate research seminar, now in its 11th year, to hosting countless well-attended lectures, panels, conferences, and other events, the work of the center holds a central space in our university and in the broader intellectual community here for its consistently rigorous inquiry, its support of academic excellence, and its acknowledgement of the demands of global justice. Last year's annual lecture was given by a professor of conflict medicine who's an award-winning reconstructive surgeon, Professor Ghassan Abu Sitta, known for his humanitarian work in Gaza, Syria, and Yemen. Tonight, we hear from a historian with a wide-angle view on how we think of and speak of law, religion, and contemporary conflict and genocide. I look forward to hearing our speaker, and with that, I'll give the floor over to Dr. Nimer Sultany, chair of the Center for Palestine Studies.
Thank you so much, Dean Eddy. Thank you all for being here. The Center for Palestine Studies started this lecture series 12 years ago, in March 2014, with a lecture by the eminent Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi. And since then, we had the privilege of hosting many prominent intellectuals to discuss the persistence of the question of Palestine. This critical discussion of Palestine is even more essential and urgent today. In July 2025, the Republican-led Committee on Education and Workforce in the US Congress conducted a hearing entitled Anti-Semitism in Higher Education, in which lawmakers continued their attack on academic freedom and freedom of speech on US campuses. They grilled leaders of prominent academic institutions, naming in particular our guest, Dr. Ussama Makdisi, who is the professor of history and Chancellor's chair at the University of California, Berkeley, where he is also the May Ziadi chair and faculty director of the Palestinian and Arab Studies program. In September 2025, UC Berkeley succumbed to governmental pressure and disclosed the names of 160 students, faculty, and staff to Trump administration officials as part of a federal investigation into allegations of the so-called anti-Semitism on campus. One of the names included in this unprecedented crackdown on academic freedom was Professor Makdisi's name. A month earlier, Professor Makdisi warned in an article for The Jacobin that American legislation on protected identities, which is supposed to foster intercommunal relations, is being instrumentalized to protect Zionism from criticism as if it were an innate characteristic of all Jews. It is no wonder that Professor Makdisi is being targeted, because he is a prominent Palestinian intellectual who teaches Palestinian, Arab, and Ottoman history and who writes against the grain, dispelling popular myths and misleading academic representations of the Middle East. Prior to joining Berkeley, Professor Makdisi was the first holder of Arab American Educational Foundation Chair of Arab Studies at Rice University in Houston, Texas. In April 2009, the Carnegie Corporation named Professor Makdisi a Carnegie Scholar as part of its effort to promote original scholarship regarding Muslim societies and communities, both in the United States and abroad. In 2012-2013, Professor Makdisi was an invited resident fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study, Berlin. He was later awarded the Berlin Prize and spent the spring 2018 semester as a fellow at the American Academy of Berlin. He is currently the president of the Middle East Studies Association. Professor Makdisi has published widely on Ottoman and Arab history, as well as on US-Arab relations and US missionary work in the Middle East. For over 2 decades, he critically examined notions of sectarianism and coexistence in Middle Eastern history, rejecting reductionist dichotomies imposed on discussions of the Middle East and the Arab world. In 2000, he published his first book, The Culture of Sectarianism, Community, History, and Violence in 19th Century Ottoman Lebanon, which became the classic reference on the modernity of sectarian politics in the Arab world, drawing attention to the interaction of Western intervention, Ottoman imperial reform, and mass peasant politics in conditioning the novel formation of sectarian systems of political representation. In 2008, he published his book, Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conversion of the Middle East, a pioneering work in transnational history, which was the winner of the 2008 Albert Hourani Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association and the 2009 John Hope Franklin Prize of the American Studies Association. In 2010, he published his book, Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of US-Arab Relations, 1820 to 2001, contextualizing for a popular audience US-Arab relations in a far longer period than is usually conceived, recounting the birth and transformation of the Arab idea of America. It notably centers the Nakba as a decisive moment of rupture for many Arabs who had once looked more favorably to US power than to any other metropole. His work has thus far culminated with his 2019 book, Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World. Building on his previous work, this book disputes 2 pervasive myths. The first is that of the Orient or the Middle East as plagued by endemic ancient sectarian hatred. And the second is the instrumentalized notion of coexistence, often invoked in the Arab world, which papers over difficult histories of inequality and struggle. These myths preclude from the popular imagination and scholarly discussion, on the one hand, factors of colonial disposition and imperial violence, and on the other hand, what he identifies as the ecumenical frame, a consciously willed and prevalent Arab tradition of multi-religious coexistence, one that sought to, and often did, reconcile secular political equality with religious diversity. This tradition, he argues, was forged out of the late 19th and early 20th Arab experience. Writing against cultural essentialism and refuting exceptionalism, Professor Makdisi insists on placing social phenomena in a historical and comparative context that foregrounds the modern problems of sectarianism, anti-sectarianism, and citizenship in the Arab world, with racist segregation in the United States, anti-Semitism in Europe, communalism in South Asia, and tribalism in Africa. Today, Professor Makdisi will deliver the Center for Palestine Studies annual lecture with the title, History, Gaza, and the Question of Genocide. I'm truly honored to welcome Professor Makdisi to SOAS. He will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and discussion. The event is being recorded, so please take that into account if you decide to participate in the discussion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ussama Makdisi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Nimer Sultany. That was a really generous and elaborate introduction, which I always say whenever you go give a talk, people say they read the bio, but they just read the bio on the website. And here in Nimer, really, you went far beyond. So I'm really deeply embarrassed and humbled, but very grateful to you and to SOAS for this invitation to deliver the annual lecture for this extraordinary Center for Palestine Studies. Coming from the US, it's unbelievable that there is such a center and that there was a dean of the college, Professor Bruce Jones. Thank you as well first of all, for supporting this extraordinary project and for allowing a space in a world of diminishing spaces where one can talk, hopefully, openly and freely about one of the great depravities of our age, but also one of the great sort of urgent moral calls of our age, what to do about Palestine, what to do about history, what to do about really the genocide that's ongoing, let alone, of course, what we all know is going on now in Iran and the US-Israeli war on Iran, which I guess we can talk about maybe a little later after when I'm done, because I can't really change. I could just throw out the lecture and start again and just talk about what's going on, but you don't need me for that. You probably know just as much as I do. I also would like to acknowledge some of my family members who are here. Whenever I give lectures, oftentimes my family, my brothers, my nieces, my cousins happen to be in the audience today. My sister-in-law is here, and I'm very grateful for her and for her mother and for everyone else whom I know in this room, my former student, Professor Nate George, also very honored to be here and to have him here as well. So Nimer told me not to dumb this lecture down. He said, the audience at SOAS is not your typical audience, that this is an educated audience who knows a lot about the history of Palestine and who can sort of handle a 40-minute lecture that can be sometimes a bit academic. So I apologize in advance, but here it goes. Because it's certainly the fact, at least for me, quite honestly, that, and for I'm sure for almost everyone in this room, that for the past 3 years we've witnessed the most explicit, the most intense, the most relentless, can you hear me in the back? The most relentless bombardment of a concentrated urban space in modern history. The fastest deliberate starvation of any population in recorded history. The greatest number of journalists killed in any conflict anywhere in the world. The greatest number of UN staff killed in any conflict since the founding of the UN. The greatest number of child amputees in any modern war. The relentless targeting, since you had Ghassan Abu Sitta here last year, the targeting of doctors and teachers, hospitals and shelters, and the destruction, of course, of every single university in Gaza. Yet in the face of this enormous, this enormity, this depravity of the Gaza genocide, there was also, of course, and I'm sure many in this room bear witness to this, an enormous wave of global revulsion, including at the heart of many of the same states and societies that have been participating in enabling the mass slaughter in Gaza. So there's been, on the one hand, the depravity, and there's also been the revulsion at the depravity, but then, of course, after the revulsion and in the face of the revulsion and protests around virtually every single society that I'm aware of, Western society, there has also been, of course, and I'm acutely aware of this, Nimer referred to this now in his introduction, there's been this unrelenting campaign of censorship, of denial, of deflection, and, of course, finally, of mass repression that's ensued. Here in Britain, of course, I don't need to tell you about what's happened to members of Palestine Action, including somebody in the audience here who is being prosecuted. There is, of course, in America, where I teach at Berkeley, but not just at Berkeley, across the country, there has been the weaponization of the charges of anti-Semitism that's helped to crush the largest or the most significant student protests in the last few decades. Certainly the first student uprisings, in a sense, that centered the question of Palestine. This weaponization has also paved the way for the near total gutting of civil rights as a meaningful category vis-a-vis the federal government and its question of education, the defunding of universities, the deportation of students, the firing of faculty, and as I speak, the very serious threat to what Americans like to think of as a hallowed First Amendment. And in Germany, where Nimer alluded to the fact that I spent a year and then a semester in Germany in two different periods in the 2010s, in what I think now, when I think back on it as the final decade of the Western liberal age, I could not have imagined the absurdity of a minister of culture saying, as she did in 2000, I think it was 2023 or 24, that she clapped only for the Jewish director, not his Palestinian colleague of the film No Other Land. The whole idea of someone even saying something as absurd and as obscene as this tells you just the level of depravity that we're dealing with, not just the killing in Gaza, but then the way people have in Western societies, especially at official levels, have an inability to actually talk about what is going on in any sort of humane manner. Recall, of course, as many of you do, Walter Benjamin's haunting words, that there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Now, Benjamin, of course, was the famous, brilliant German Jewish philosopher who committed suicide in 1940 and who was caught up in the maelstrom of Nazi fascism and anti-Semitism. As I said, he committed suicide rather than be captured by sort of those who were working with or collaborating with the Nazis just before the Holocaust of Europe's Jews. The question that concerns me, in truth, is less to tell you about Benjamin, because I'm not an expert on Benjamin really, but rather to tell you about how and why a different genocide, the Gaza genocide, that occurred more than 80 years after the Holocaust, has been justified by reference to the Holocaust and to European anti-Semitism, the very European anti-Semitism that caught up Benjamin. So more precisely, what I really want to try to do today is I want to try to explain how it is that the most awful depravity, and I keep using the word depravity because that's the word that comes most naturally to me, of our age, that all of us have witnessed on our phones and on TV and on various other forms, the greatest depravity of our age reflects the cynicism. The fact that the Gaza genocide could happen reflects the cynicism at the heart of a Western liberal politics and of Western political order, that's based on, at the moral level, at the discursive level, at the alleged politics of atonement in relationship to the earlier depravity of the Holocaust. So I'm going to try to link what happened in Gaza to the way European societies and politicians talk about having atoned for the Holocaust. And what's the relationship between all these things? The Gaza genocide, in other words, is not simply an indictment of the state that carried it out, in other words, Israel, but it's also an indictment of an entire cultural and political Western liberal post-war edifice that created the Palestine question in the first half of the 20th century to atone, and then eventually supported the state of Israel at the expense of the Palestinians, to atone explicitly to its own prior Jewish, what Europeans used to call their Jewish question. The West, in short, gave birth to two closely related maladies. On the one hand, first it produced anti-Semitism in the 19th century, racial anti-Semitism in the 19th century, and then through a process of what it regarded as its anti-Semitism, it created what we could think of today as anti-Palestinianism. Hatred of Jews certainly predates hatred of Palestinians, but the latter is incomprehensible without reference to the former. So I'll try to explain what all this means in actual through a very brief history of the 20th century. So Palestinians, in other words, have been systematically dehistoricized before they could be dehumanized and then eventually obliterated. They, along with Arabs and Muslims more broadly, have been consistently rendered peoples without history, people without ethical or political importance, peoples whose past and therefore present and future has been overwritten by a deeply Eurocentric and profoundly philo-Zionist narrative that embraces and elevates the idea of Israel as part of an elaborate discourse of resolving Europe's so-called Jewish question. This occurred in stages. First, by ignoring the Palestinians from the birth of the Zionist movement in the 19th century until 1917, the Balfour Declaration. Then acknowledging the Palestinians as a problem until 1947. Then unseeing them after the Nakba of 1948. And fourth and finally, the stage that takes us all the way to our own time, demonizing Palestinians. This overriding is one that valorizes the imperatives of a nationalist Zionist ideology that Benjamin himself strongly rejected. It cherishes and celebrates the creation of an exclusively Jewish state in a multi-religious land, an exclusively Jewish state in a multi-religious land, irrespective of the obvious implications that such a state would entail and has entailed for millions of non-Jewish men, women, and children, of course, in other words, Muslims and Christians, Palestinians, as part of, again, the justification that I come back to over and over again, as part of an enlightened Western civilized world that, on the one hand, claims to value Jewish life in the wake of the Holocaust by devaluing Muslim and Christian Palestinian history and life. And the question is, okay, where does all this come from? Where does this question begin? In the 19th century, and some people will say Christian Zionism begins before the 19th century. But the reality is that Protestant enthusiasts and theologians in Europe and North America had long before the 19th century fantasized about the idea of the so-called return of the Jews to biblical Palestine as part of a sort of a reading, a theology, as part of thinking about the end times, as part of a prophetic tradition. But they had no interest, these Christian, so-called, what we today refer to as Christian Zionists, they had no interest in the actually existing diverse population of actual Palestine. So in the 19th century, up until this moment of the late 19th century, these Christian Zionists would fantasize about Palestine. They would think about the return of Jews. They didn't even have many Jewish friends. It was all an abstraction for them, based on a literal reading of the Bible, and especially the Old Testament. But they had no interest either in actual Jews or in, of course, the Palestinians. Then, on top of that, you have to add the elaboration or the development or the beginnings of a Jewish Zionist nationalist movement that emerged, again, not in Palestine and not in the Ottoman Empire and not in any part of the Middle East which has indigenous Jewish communities, but of course in Eastern and Central Europe, among European Ashkenazi Jews such as Theodor Herzl. And this is one of the most remarkable and, of course, the most essential points in understanding. Whenever anyone explains, you have to start with this point, that Zionism begins in Europe. It did not begin among the Jewish communities of the Middle East. It's not from our part of the world. It belongs and came from Europe. Part of this, of course, is a fact of geography. If you just look at the maps and you know something about the history, Zionism was not born among the ancient Jewish communities of the East, but in distant Europe. Its leaders were not Arab or Eastern or Sephardic Jews, but European Ashkenazi Jews. Herzl, then Chaim Weizmann, then Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Menachem Begin, Benjamin Netanyahu. Its ethno-religious nationalist ideology was forged not by the pluralism of the Middle East or the Ottoman Empire, but rather by the competing racial and ethnic and linguistic nationalisms of Europe. The racial anti-Semitism of the West, that was one of the main catalysts, of course, for the rise of a European Jewish nationalism that we refer to as Zionism, was completely alien to the rhythms of religious difference and coexistence, so familiar to the diverse inhabitants of the Ottoman Islamic East. So recall as well that the Zionist project developed openly in its first decades as a colonialist project. They didn't hide the fact that they were colonizers. In an era when European empires routinely segregated humanity into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. So while leading Zionists grappled with racial anti-Semitism of Europe, they were also desperate to belong to this Europe. They expressed, shared, contributed to, and circulated many of the foundationalist racist tropes of 19th century Western culture. For example, ideas that there was a non-West that was manifestly inferior, that the lands of indigenous peoples anywhere in the world were essentially empty and thus open to colonization and improvement, that the removal of native peoples was both justifiable and necessary. In his German language 1896 book, The Jewish State, Herzl, of course he didn't write it in Arabic or in Turkish or in Hebrew or in Armenian or any of the local Kurdish, any of the native languages of the East, he wrote it, of course, in German. He wrote that the Jewish nationalist state he dreamed of would become part of what he described as, quote, a rampart, and this is a famous quotation from the book, a rampart of a portion of Europe against Asia. Recall as well that one of the notorious slogans of the Zionist movement that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, is the idea of a land without a people for a people without a land. This is one of the famous, again, Zionist slogans. It actually has Christian Zionist origins. The underlying point here is that both Christian and Jewish versions of colonial Zionism were predicated on solving Europe's Jewish question by removing, quote, restoring Jews en masse from Europe to Palestine as if Palestinians did not exist, or more fundamentally, did not matter. The British Balfour Declaration, just to move us ahead, so the British Balfour Declaration of 1917 described the Palestinians, who, of course, everyone here knows were the vast majority of the population of Palestine, not by what they were, but as merely the non-Jewish communities of Palestine, as opposed to the Jewish people, who are, even in the text itself, the very brief Balfour Declaration, are valued civilizationally, historically, as far and politically far more important than the non-Jewish communities. But at the heart of this embrace of Zionism as colonialism was also Zionism as anti-Semitism. The solution to Europe's Jewish question would come, as if by providence, by exporting it to the Middle East, and there creating, of course, a new question called the question of Palestine. So you go from a Jewish question in Europe that gets resolved by creating in Palestine a question of Palestine, or what becomes known as the Arab question inside Israel. In his preface, so this is Balfour in 1917, and then if you read in what Balfour wrote in 1918, which appeared in the 1919 introduction to Nahum Sokolow, who was a famous Zionist ideologue, who published this book called The History of Zionism that some of you may be familiar with. What's so interesting is what actually how Balfour justifies his support of Zionism. He doesn't say geopolitics, he doesn't say, the resources of the Middle East, no, not at all. What he says is that he hoped that Zionism was going to succeed. But he said, if it does succeed, quote, it will do great spiritual and material work for the Jews, but not for them alone. For as I read its meaning, it is, among other things, a serious endeavor to mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or absorb. Surely for this, if for no other reason, it should receive our support. In other words, here it is, as clear as day, like Balfour describing one of the reasons why he supports Zionism, both to resolve the Jewish question, but also by himself accepting the premise of the so-called Jewish question. As for Palestinians, Balfour had this to say about them in 1919. And I'm sorry, the text is small, but I'll read some of the key parts. This is a famous confidential memorandum that Balfour wrote in 1919 after the Balfour Declaration. In fact, after the so-called King Crane Commission, which I can talk about later, which is an American commission that asked people in the Middle East how they want to determine their own political future, and which concluded by surveying people in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, that the vast majority of people were opposed to Zionism and wanted independence. Balfour basically said, well, it doesn't matter what anyone says and what the people of the region say, because, he says, Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, and this is an often quoted memorandum by Balfour, Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions and present needs, in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Again, every word, as every literary scholar will tell you, as Edward Said, of course, used to say, every word in this is crucial. Every single word. The desires and prejudices of the Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. They don't belong there, they just happen to be there. And they don't have dreams or aspirations, they have just desires and prejudices. But of course, at least here you could say better than the Balfour Declaration, at least he refers to them as Arabs, as opposed to just non-Jewish communities. But the point of all this is to say there is a profound obfuscation, obviously, a deliberate obfuscation, both in the Christian Zionist movement, then in the Jewish Zionist movement, and then in the supporters, the British supporters of the Zionist movement, that became ever more dangerous in Palestine and to Palestinians as Zionism moved from, you could say, a theological or colonial fantasy into colonial practice in what became mandatory Palestine. The British mandate over a post-Ottoman Palestine that was established in 1920 at the San Remo Conference and then was formalized in 1922 privileged foreign European Jewish Zionists legally, administratively, and politically. I don't have time to go into all the history of the mandate, but I'm sure you know this already. Native Muslim and Christian Palestinian bodies, nevertheless, were there. They were actual people, obviously, on the ground in Palestine. And they had, for both the British and for the Jewish nationalist movement, the Zionists, they had an extraordinarily unwelcome presence. The fact that there were bodies was obviously a huge problem for the Zionist movement. How do you create a Jewish state where so many Palestinians lived? So unlike the distant academic Protestant clergymen obsessed with biblical prophecies, colonial Zionists were increasingly preoccupied with what they began to talk about once they moved to Palestine with their so-called Arab question. So we go from a Jewish question in Europe to an Arab question created in Palestine, not of course by Arabs, just like the Jewish question wasn't created by Jews, but created by the Zionists and by their British supporters, as to, in other words, what do we do with the Palestinians living in this place? How do we create a Jewish state? As soon as Zionism moved from Christian and Jewish Western colonial fantasy to Western colonial practice, Muslim and Christian Palestinians who had been basically ignored were seen, obviously. You have to see the problem in front of you. They were there. And as such, they constituted a real impediment to the successful unfolding of colonial Zionism. The more the Zionist state structure was put in place with British colonial support between 1920 and 1948, the more native anti-colonial resistance it generated. Native resistance, in turn, compelled Zionist colonists to grapple more seriously with what they described as their Arab problem. And that, of course, then leads us to Vladimir Jabotinsky, or Zaiv Jabotinsky, he took on a Hebrew name, and his famous sort of prescription known as this essay known as the Iron Wall, published in Russian originally, in which basically the argument was very simple, that you have to crush the native population, and he admitted they were natives, and you have to crush them not just physically, but you have to crush them psychologically. Once they give up and they see this iron wall of Zionism supported by the British that is so powerful and so immovable, the Palestinians, the natives, will give up. So this is the Iron Wall. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the point is that the British colonial rulers of Palestine, not just the Zionists who were supported by the British, but their sort of colonial supporters and enablers, also had to figure out a way of what to do with the so-called Arabs of Palestine, who were in the way of the successful unfolding of Zionism. So after the 1936 revolt, or the largest general strike in modern Arab history, the British then sort of send a commission, one of the many commissions they send to Palestine in the mandate period. This was known as the Peel Commission. And it's this commission that in 1937 draws up the first extraordinarily prejudicial partition plan that violated 100% the clear British pledges over the span of 20 years to the native Palestinian population that their civil and religious rights, remember the Balfour Declaration, were going to be violated. And more than that, their lives and their properties were going to be confiscated to make way for the creation of a Jewish state. Now, what's interesting when you go back and you read the archives and you read the British Peel Commission and their deliberations, both the public ones and the confidential ones, is how, of course, they foreshadowed, on the one hand, the partition of Palestine in 1947, the UN partition plan that most people have heard of. But what's interesting is both Peel and the UN partition plan a decade later prioritized the making of a Jewish state. That was the priority. How do we create a Jewish state? Not what do we do with the Palestinians, or what do we do for the Palestinians? How do we create a Jewish state given the fact that there are so many Palestinians or natives? And so both embraced as a central idea that the dispossessing of native Palestinian majority of much of its land and homes to make way for a Jewish state was both necessary and inevitable. And this is before the Holocaust, of course, the Peel Plan. The 1937 British Peel Plan, in fact, admitted plainly, if you go read the text itself, this is from and this is, all, of course, all online for everyone to go look up and read for themselves. They said very clearly that any partition of Palestine was going to be unjust to the Palestinians, to the Arabs, to the Arab natives who owned the vast majority of the land. And what's remarkable when you read the conclusion of the Royal Commission, the Peel Commission's plan, is how they characterize, how they try to reconcile this. So what they said is that they lauded, they celebrated the proverbial, what they refer to here as the generosity of the Arabs, whom they say are going to justify who were going to justify their role at some sacrifice to themselves into solving what the Commission referred to as the West's Jewish problem. In other words, they're Arabs, they're a generous people, they're going to help us solve our Jewish problem by giving up their land to create a Jewish state. Yes, it's not ideal, and yes, there wasn't a Jewish problem here in Palestine, and there wasn't an Arab-Jewish problem in Palestine before we showed up, we the British, but the Arabs are a very generous people, they're going to help us resolve our problem. And it's a remarkable document when you read it. You read, and you think this is the best they could say. And right away, of course, in 1938, a year later, in 1938, again, sorry for my terrible sort of PowerPoint skills, but in 1938, George Antonius, who of course was from Palestine, Lebanon, Palestine, and by the way, Nimer, sorry, I'm also, my father's Lebanese. I have to say, I'm both, but I'm Palestinian too, full, as Nadir Shalhoub said. Kilna Bilad al-Sham. But the point is that George Antonius wrote this famous book called The Arab Awakening in 1938, specifically to respond to the Peel. At least a part of it is to respond to the Peel Commission. And what's so interesting is that Antonius, at the very end of the book, talks about the Nazi persecution, the anti-Semitism in Europe. And he says, one of the most humane and beautiful things, he says the treatment meted out to Jews in Germany and other European countries is a disgrace to its authors and to modern civilization. This is 1938. But posterity, he added, will not exonerate any country that fails to bear its proper share of sacrifices needed to alleviate Jewish suffering and distress. To place the brunt of the burden upon Arab Palestine is a miserable evasion of the duty that lies upon the whole of the civilized world. It is also morally outrageous. You cannot resolve your Jewish question at our expense. There's no morality in this whatsoever. Antonius, of course, was pleading and writing, and we'll come back to this later. What does it mean to plead and to write and to ask and to abide by the liberal rules of rational discourse and argumentation and archives and so on when the other side is not prepared to listen at all? Of course, Antonius was not privy to the secret testimonies that the Commission heard from Jewish and Christian Zionists such as Chaim Weizmann or Winston Churchill, who compared Palestinians to dogs in a manger. And this is, again, an infamous quotation, that the Palestinians are dogs in a manger, and they don't have any right to Palestine any more than the so-called black people of Australia or the Red Indians of America have a right to their lands in America or in Australia. An extraordinarily sort of overt racial hierarchy. But the whole point of this is to say again, one more time, as if we need to be told again, the Palestinians, for Churchill, as for the Peel Commission, have no intrinsic cultural, civilizational, or historical significance. They're just there. Nevertheless, despite Antonius's pleas, US politicians in 1947 rejected allowing the survivors of the Holocaust, between, of course, Antonius's writing and then the UN partition plan of 1947, of course, there was the Holocaust, and there was the persecution and the destruction of European Jewish communities. And US politicians and other European politicians sort of were seized with the question of what to do with the Jewish displaced persons, the refugees or the survivors of the Holocaust, the so-called displaced persons who were languishing in camps. And the US and Britain refused to take in hundreds of thousands of Jews. They said, send them to Palestine, which of course is exactly what Balfour himself had said, remember, in his preface to Nahum Sokolow's book. Again, we can't solve this problem here. The best place is to solve it there. So in other words, whether you say this is idealism or cynicism or just whatever it is, it's also a fundamentally anti-Palestinian racism at a most profound level. The interesting thing, again, is that US politicians, journalists, intellectuals, cultural figures, theologians, also in 1947 and 48, supported sending 100,000 Jewish displaced persons, 1946, sorry, sending 100,000 Jewish displaced persons to Palestine in the name of decency and humanitarianism. And then after the UN partition plan and after the idea was we need to sort of solve the great urgent crisis of Jewish displaced persons, send them to Palestine, which is why, again, why so many European states and the United States and the Soviet Union all voted for the partition of Palestine, and why not a single state from the region nor India or Pakistan, who had gone through the horrors of partition, voted for partition. So again, just this is all sort of really fundamental and basic. But even the UN and even the British didn't vote, but the French and all the Europeans and others who voted for the partition plan and the United States in the UN deliberations, what's interesting is that then, even in 1947, they acknowledged the same thing. Yes, there's going to be harm done to the native population, but in the end, there's a greater good at play. You know, we understand that there's going to be harm, but we have to take into account the urgent question of Jewish displaced persons, because that horror, the horror of what happened in Europe, needed, in the European view, urgent redress. And this redress, they said, embracing a Zionist logic, could only occur in Palestine at the expense of the Palestinians. So all this, and this is not about sort of making atonement for the Holocaust, this is simply about dealing with an urgent political problem, and of course the fact that there was already a Zionist movement in place. In the wake of the Holocaust and the creation of a new international community that disavowed the overt racism of Nazi Germany, but turned a blind eye to racism across the rest of the West, the vague imperial Christian Zionist philo-Semitism that I talked about earlier was effaced or replaced by a far more practical, secular, and temporally urgent language of saving Jews and ending the Palestine problem. So in other words, we're moving, so it's not about theology, it's not about Christian Zionism, it really was a much more political, conscious decision, a humanitarian decision, allegedly, to solve Europe's Jewish problem and the crisis of Jewish displaced persons at the expense of the Palestinians. And the irony was that the Arab, in a sense, Arab diplomats at the UN, there were several Arab states who were represented at the UN, they were heard from. They spoke in the UN, in the General Assembly. And they spoke about Palestine, and they were heard by other members, but without the emotion, without the identification, without the connection that Jewish diplomats, survivors, and refugees made who were arguing for the Zionist case. There was nothing the Palestinians or the Arabs could say, let alone do, that made any appreciable dent in this powerful equivalence between Zionism and the sudden post-war Western desire to be done with this Jewish problem in a manner that satisfied the Zionist movement that claimed to speak on behalf of Jews worldwide. That the Palestinians were to be sacrificed at the altar of philo-Zionism was acknowledged only obliquely, since virtually every Western representative at the UN insisted that they were cognizant and sympathetic to the aspirations of the so-called Arab inhabitants of Palestine. So in other words, they weren't doing this simply because they hated Palestinians. That's not the discourse at all. It's a completely different discourse. It's this humanitarian discourse that privileges one group of people over another, building, of course, on legacies of colonialism and racism and so on. The UNSCOP proposal they voted on, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, the partition plan that they voted on, and the geopolitics it reflected clearly, obviously indicated something else. So on the one hand, they say they cared about the Arabs, but they really didn't care enough. And then, of course, we have the Nakba, we have the 1948, that resolves, of course, at least the Israelis thought this, the new state of Israel thought this, that resolved brutally and categorically, they thought, the problem of the majority of Palestinian bodies in a Jewish state that had preoccupied the colonial Zionists throughout the Mandate period. So before, during, and after the war of 1948, the Zionist forces expelled well over 850,000 Palestinians to neighboring lands, and as everyone knows here, this is history that you're familiar with, expropriated their homes, their lands, their books, their libraries, their archives, their property. You know, my mother, of course, her relatives lost their home in Jerusalem. This was the moment, of course, when the Gaza Strip was created as a mangled geography amputated from the rest of historic Palestine. Again, liberal Western states and societies and leaders hailed the creation of an ethno-religious nationalist Jewish state in a historically multi-religious land. Leading American liberal figures, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, the co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, both rationalized and justified the uprooting of Palestinians. So again, they see them, and now they're going to begin to justify their expulsions. Then they blamed, in fact, the Palestinians for resisting their own displacement. Roosevelt was especially egregious in this regard. And she justified her support for colonial Zionism by, again, dehistoricizing the Palestinians, whom she thought of as primitive, irrational, and aggressive. So again, this is a wonderful picture where Roosevelt there is with these Jewish children in Israel, again, symbolizing the youth and symbolizing the future and symbolizing, of course, Europe and the West. And then there she is with the Arab sheik, you know, the idea of this kind of who asks her, if I remember this caption, who asks her, will he marry her? And she says, you know, how many wives do you have? And he says, I have 18 or something, I can't remember, but like so Orientalist, so stereotypical. But again, you cannot empathize with the Arab in this, but you can certainly empathize and identify with the young Israelis. So this is from a Western perspective. World War II and the creation of Israel in 1948 reflected more than Western settler colonialism as a practice of native elimination. So as much as it's true that, of course, there is settler colonialism and there is elimination of the Palestinians at the heart of the Nakba, I think it's important for us to recognize that the support of Israel and the identification with Israel reflected more than just settler colonialism support by other settler colonial societies. It also reflected the attempt to reconstitute Western post-war humanism after the Second World War. This humanism was reborn after World War II in Europe with a philo-Zionist core at its heart and with a Palestine exception at its heart as well. So in the wake of World War II, as historian Daniel Cohen notes in his new book, Philo-Semitism in Europe After the War, the European philosophical, religious, and moral rehabilitation of man, white Western man, of course, was predicated on the recognition of the evils of the history of anti-Semitism that had culminated with the now disavowed Nazism. The creation of Israel as a Jewish state therefore represented an implied Western atonement for its own terrible past. There was anti-Semitism, it culminates in the Holocaust, and now we atone for the Holocaust with an embrace of a Jewish state in Israel, in Palestine. Germany, of course, as everyone knows here, paid reparations to the state of Israel in the 1950s. And in this philo-Zionist turn, the Jewish victims of Nazi genocide and the horrors of Nazi racism were transformed into an allegory of the modern West fighting for freedom. And by virtue of Eurocentrism at the heart of Western historiography and philosophy, it was turned into an allegory for the modern world fighting against totalitarianism. In other words, we in the West, we're so humane, we're so good, that we can recognize the evils of Nazism and make restitution to the victims of Nazism, the Jewish victims of Nazism, because we're so moral and because we're so cognizant of our history and we're so capable of self-criticism that no other people are capable of. But of course, what's so interesting is what Aimé Césaire, let me find if I can find it here. What Aimé Césaire said at that time, because the whole point of this Western sort of attempt to claim atonement, to support the idea of a new state of Israel established in the name of the Jewish people after the Holocaust, was key to the reconstitution of a post-war Western humanism, but Palestinians, of course, were completely invisibilized. They were erased. So now we've gone from recognizing their bodies, now we're going to go back to the invisibilization of Palestinians in the post-war, post-Israel period. It's not a coincidence that the great black anti-colonial poet and writer Aimé Césaire castigated, condemned this so-called post-World War II Western conception of the rights of man as, quote, pseudo-humanism at exactly this moment in his book, The Discourse on Colonialism, that was first published in 1955. Césaire was not writing about Palestinians specifically, but he was writing more broadly about the Arabs in Algeria, blacks in South Africa, Madagascar and the Caribbean, and the Vietnamese, and other indigenous peoples around the world. Césaire noted how this Western pseudo-humanism was based on what he called a narrow and fragmentary and a sordidly racist conception of the rights of man. So in other words, Césaire was disgusted in 1955 by how post-war European states and societies were willing to finally condemn Hitler and anti-Semitism after World War II and during World War II, but refused to abandon most of their colonial possessions without a bitter and sustained fight. Instead, and this is the crucial point, by splitting the fight against anti-Semitism, which the post-war West now deplored, from the fight against racism and colonialism more broadly, which the post-war West continued to uphold, Césaire anticipated how one could love the now largely absent Jews of Europe and love them instead in their new and in the eyes of Western philo-Zionists proper home in Israel, Palestinians be damned. And so Césaire's whole point is like, on what grounds do the British, who hold on to Kenya and fight a brutal war to suppress Kenyan independence, and of course had sort of suppressed Palestinian independence. On what grounds do they now claim to be sort of proper humanists? And the French, who supported the state of Israel and were the main armors of the state of Israel, of course, were brutally suppressing the Algerians and the Vietnamese, and in Madagascar and other places. And that whole argument is so important. The Western denial of an ancient, sustained, and meaningful Palestinian relationship to Palestine has, of course, since 1948, had profoundly corrosive moral, political, and ethical effects. It has led to a set of dogmas that continue to shape how current events, including, of course, what's happening in Palestine, but also in Iran, are viewed and interpreted across the mainstream West. The most important of these dogmas is not to question the implications of Israel as a Jewish state for the native Muslim and Christian Palestinian survivors of the Nakba, who remain until now condemned at best to be precarious second-class citizens of a state that does not actually want them. So I'm talking about the citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel. Nearly 5 million other Palestinians, of course, live in various states of humiliating unfreedom as stateless non-citizens under what every major human rights organization, as you know, has described as apartheid in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and of course, you have the brutalized and devastated Gaza Strip. And then, of course, you still have millions of others who remain in exile, unable to return to their homes because they are not Jewish. Yet to question the professed Jewishness of the state, despite the overt racism of the state, practices towards its non-Jewish subjects and citizens remains largely unthinkable across the official West. For to question colonial Zionism is to question the sincerity and the implications of the West's alleged turn on its own anti-Semitic past after the Second World War, which is a foundation of post-war humanism. So that's one thing. You cannot question this. And if you do, you're an anti-Semite. The second philo-Zionist dogma that shapes the contours of the post-war Western humanism was to regard Israel very much as an extension of an idealized West. We go back to this picture. It had classical music, it had European institutions, it had a modern army, it had pioneers, communal kibbutzes, and above all, it was a young nation that contrasted with the background images of squalid, nameless Arab refugees. Israel was what the West wanted and needed after World War II, an emancipated part of itself allegedly purged of its historical anti-Semitism, but of course itself outside of Europe. In the 1950s, therefore, Western liberals and leftists, not the conservatives, overwhelmingly and enthusiastically supported Israel despite its treatment of the now largely invisibilized Palestinians. And this included trade unions, liberal theologians, I've already mentioned Nimer, radicals, socialists, liberals, communists. For the great black radical writers and thinkers such as W.E.B. Du Bois or C.L.R. James, from them to Eleanor Roosevelt or the anthropologist Margaret Mead, the identification with Israel was reflected again in the refusal to see or comment or talk about the Palestinians. And I could go on more and more about Margaret Mead, who was a super famous, very famous, obviously, for those who know, cultural anthropologist, one of the most famous cultural anthropologists of the 20th century, who actually went to Israel in the 1950s, toured Israel for a few weeks, goes back to New York, where she lectured at the Zionist Organization of America House. She lectured in Tel Aviv at the Zionist Organization of America House in Tel Aviv, and then she lectured at the Theodor Herzl Institute in New York in 1957 at the invitation of none other than her friend, Dr. Patai. And that was Raphael Patai, the author, I think, of The Arab Bind that was first published in 1973 and then republished in 2004 in the wake of the US invasion of Iraq. And the point about this extraordinary lecture that Mead gives, both in Israel and in New York, is how she talks about the Israeli Jews specifically as an extraordinary people, as a people unlike white Australians who are alien in Australia and the climate of Australia. She says that the Jewish colonists or settlers have an extraordinary relationship, she says, to every stone, every tree, every hill, because of all the words they've heard all their lives from the Bible. In other words, even as they're destroying Palestinian villages, uprooting trees, she can't see. This is one of the most famous anthropologists and ethnographers. she just could not see or not talk about Muslim or Christian Palestinians. She was awed by what she regarded in the 1950s as the rootedness of Jews in their ancestral lands. Again, no mention of the Palestinians. The third dogma was, so the first dogma was the Jewish state. You cannot question this. The second dogma is the identification with Israel as part of the West, but a sort of revivified part of the West. The third dogma was to make actual Palestinians, insofar as they were seen at all, unrelatable to Western humanism, except, as Edward Said famously said in Orientalism, a negative value. And to represent Palestinians, therefore, as either sullen, dehistoricized refugees, or equally dehistoricized, enraged and violent people who violate the very core of post-war Western humanism because they oppose colonial Zionism. So stripped of context, stripped of history, stripped of any acknowledgement of their lived experience, the Palestinians have been made, and this goes on until today, into beings who cannot love, they can only hate. Palestinians are cast outside of proper history, and they appear to return only to threaten what has been in reality an irredeemably Eurocentric telos of a sanctified Israel. And it's a narrative loop that is almost impossible, at least in the way it's been constructed, to puncture. After 1948, in any case, the Zionist movement coalesced around the new state of Israel. It built up this state, and it built also a remarkably affective, positive, emotional relationship to Israel among Jewish communities around the world. The Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, who of course many of you know, has recently explained how the Zionist movement built up an impressive and undeniably impressive lobbying presence in every major Western state, especially the United States. This was then reinforced by a campaign beginning in the late 60s into the 70s, into the 80s, a campaign of memorializing the Holocaust across the liberal West, even as Israel continued its conquest of Palestine. The United States committed itself in 1979 to building, this is under Jimmy Carter, to building the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And the museum was eventually opened in 1993. At the same time, after the Cold War ended, a reunified Germany commenced on a massive Holocaust commemoration project. And you could see this for anyone who's been to Berlin, or anywhere in Germany, you will note this as well. The flip side of this memorialization of the horror of Nazi genocide was, of course, the constant elision of the hugely consequential fact that George Antonius noted before the Holocaust in 1938, that Palestinians have collectively been made to pay the price, the heaviest price, for the creation of a Jewish state on their lands, despite the fact that they were not the agents of historical anti-Semitism, and they did not have Western-style racial anti-Semitism. So the Western discourse of atonement, I think cannot be dismissed. And the way it was constructed, and the way it was invested in for decades and decades after World War II, I think it can help us explain the furious echo chamber of self-righteous morality that was overwhelming in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th events and attacks, and the constant mantra that this was the worst attack on the Jewish people, quote, since the Holocaust. The issue at hand, of course, is how Palestinian violence has been decoupled from any sense of the actual history of the Israeli state, its violence, its colonization of Palestinians, that, of course, we have documented and has been documented endlessly. There is probably no colonial project that's been as well documented as Israel's in terms of the archives, the details. Everyone here in this room knows, scholars and human rights organizations, including Israeli human rights organizations, have created, again, and this is one of the great sort of questions I'm always struggling with, what is the point of history and archives if we have all these archives and all these documents that are readily accessible to anybody who has a computer? They're all there. The refusal to acknowledge in any way the profound injustice inherent in the British Mandate, for example, or the Nakba, or its ongoing aftermath, when we think about what Zionism means, I think explains why so many prominent figures, from Joe Biden to Keir Starmer to Donald Trump, refuse to see, to acknowledge, let alone to do something about the anachronism of an openly colonizing state that politically, administratively, and juridically is committed to the supremacy of one ethno-religious group over the others. The problem for the anti-Palestinian denialists is that the Israeli system of Jewish supremacy now, and this is where I'm going to end on this point, the reality of the Israeli system, which is so explicitly sort of committed to supremacy of one group over Jews over non-Jews in Palestine, is that it recalls very closely, once you start reading and once you know and once you start opening your eyes, what are now totally discredited systems of apartheid that used to be the norm in the Western world, but are no longer formally acceptable in the United States, in Canada, in South Africa, in Australia, or in New Zealand. Israeli leaders and individuals, however, today say things about Palestinians and Arabs, and more importantly, do things to them that are right out of the 19th century playbook of racism and colonialism. So Israeli descriptions of the Palestinians, for example, as human animals, or the children of darkness, or Jewish Israeli settlers marching in East Jerusalem chanting death to the Arabs. All this is something that is, in a sense, completely out of sync with contemporary, even Western societies. And I'm not trying to romanticize Western societies, but there's something very interesting in terms of chronology here. All this is revealing of more than a culture of denial and impunity. The point is, Israelis feel entitled to say these things because they sense that their colony, the settler colony, is out of its time. They do not see it as an anachronism increasingly discredited around the world. Instead, they reflect the fact that Israeli Zionism is very much of its liberal Western time, in the sense of a historical narrative that jumps from historical anti-Semitism to the Holocaust to Western atonement, allegedly, for the Holocaust, that cannot admit Palestinian history or Palestinian existence or Palestinian lived experience without coming face to face with the anachronism and the horror that the West, the liberal West, of course, has authorized, supported, tolerated, sustained, and nurtured for decades. And so I guess the last question I want to end with is this. What accounts, ultimately, beyond this narrative structure, and this very clear, for me, narrative structure from anti-Semitism, the reality of anti-Semitism in Europe and the West, to the reality of the Holocaust, to then the alleged atonement that never sees the Palestinians? What accounts for the toleration, ultimately today, of an extraordinarily anachronistic expressions of Zionist supremacy in Palestine and Israel? In part, there is the continued, but I think right now, and evidence all around us is there. There's a diminishing Western subscription. Not talking about the Western states, I'm talking about in Western societies. I could be wrong, and correct me if I'm wrong. But there's obviously a diminishing Western subscription, especially among younger people, of the myths that I've discussed. And there's, as more people are more familiar with the Palestinian narrative, with Palestinians as people, they refuse to continue this charade of not seeing Palestinians as people with history. In other words, they see them as people with history. After 1948, the Palestinians as a people, for example, it's true, were quickly forgotten by the international community. They became wards of the UN supervised regime of welfare known as the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, that was established obviously after the Nakba of 1948, but without political rights for the Palestinians. That was off the agenda. And then when Palestinians, of course, in the 1960s or 50s and 60s and 70s began to organize themselves into resistance movements and politics, they were, of course, demonized in the West. And this is, of course, it builds on the one hand on a long history of Western demonization of any non-Western form of resistance. But in the case of the Palestinians, of course, more so than any other group, it's not just the Palestinians are demonized because they're native, it's because they're also allegedly anti-Semitic. They don't fit in this Western sort of morality play that was constructed after World War II. And so, yet, as I said, these myths, this discourse about Palestinians is breaking down. And that's what we've seen over the past 3 years. The genocide, of course, I think it has massively increased the visibility of Palestinians. And at the same time, as I began with, it's massively increased now for the first time an extraordinary campaign of censorship. So before it was normative. You didn't have to censor because people like these great theologians and these great anthropologists and these great historians and these great academics and these great politicians and these great religious figures in the West supported Zionism. Now that's no longer the case. It's really interesting to see what's happened. This massive shift that's taken place has called an extraordinary campaign of censorship and repression. Why? Why is there this extraordinary persecution now of our students, of universities, maybe more so in the US than in Britain? You tell me. Why is there this extraordinary weaponization of claims of anti-Semitism to shut down any debate whatsoever? So my optimistic self, I'd like to end here, would love to believe that the Palestine exception, which is at the heart of Western liberalism, is beginning to break down. The cracks in the Zionist wall of denial have become so apparent to so many people from so many faiths and nationalities and walks of life all around the world. You can no longer hide it. So from the student uprisings across the world, in Europe, in the United States, other parts of the world, to the Arsenal kitman who was fired from his job because he supported Palestine, to Gary Lineker, who again was shamed and sort of kicked out of Match of the Day, Pep Guardiola, Manchester City, for all the problems of that club. At least he spoke out about the killing of children. To the various people, the elderly people, the retirees in this society, the disabled who've also spoken out and been arrested and harassed, something has shifted. And I think it's irrevocable. I don't think there's any way of putting that genie back in the bottle. For too many of our students have learned about Palestine and have related it to their own experiences. They also recognize that it's not ethical, intellectual, or academic to think of Israel today without thinking, of course, of the Palestinians from the standpoint, or thinking of Zionism, without thinking of Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. And so again, the extraordinary repression is intense, it's real. I could give you more examples about the trainings that we're being subjected to. Some of my colleagues are being subjected to. We're tracking this in the Middle East Studies Association. There's some extraordinary things that universities are doing now to shut down the debate, but at the same time, and of course, there's the censoring of TikTok and the purchase of all these things and all the clampdown that everyone's aware of. On the other hand, there is this extraordinary generational shift that cannot, I think, be denied. And so, on the one hand, you have people who are all around the world, including here, and in America, and at Berkeley, no matter how much repression there is, people no longer accept the idea of having someone sort of raise their hand and say, Winston, how many fingers am I holding up? And so when people realize that 2 + 2 = 4, they're being told, no, now 2 + 2 = 5. Whatever it is, they refuse this. And I think that's where we are right now. And the question, of course, is what's going to happen? Who is going to win out in this sort of, I think it's a titanic generational struggle. Maybe I'm romanticizing. Yeah, maybe I'm too naive, but I really do believe that the Gaza genocide is the crucible of our age. And I think on the basis of what happens, I think is the future, not just of the Palestinians, obviously first and foremost, but everyone else as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Makdisi, for this illuminating and thought-provoking lecture. So we have time now for questions and comments. We have 2 mics. So Sophia and Maeve, where are you? On either side of the auditorium. So please raise your hand, catch my eye, introduce yourself, and ask your question. So one gentleman there, please. Here at the back. Yes, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm David Ludden from New York University. Nice to see you, Ussama. I think the word terrorism basically is the key intervention with respect to the discourse that you're talking about. In a situation where resistance becomes terrorism, it changes the discourse in a way that I think makes it, to be with due respect, makes the repressive regime a bit more sustainable because of the fear that it generates as a general feature of the relationship of people with privilege to the rest of the world, is basically the way I would say it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Makdisi, for your presentation. I'm Haim Rashid from SOAS. I want to supply you with a bit of evidence which you may not be aware of because you don't live in this blessed country. We have, for the last 6 weeks, have tried to deal with the British Museum, because the British Museum, pressed by the UK Lawyers for Israel, has decided that the word Palestine itself is a problem. Now, let us not forget that the British Museum, while the British Empire doesn't exist, the most imperial museum is the British Museum. It is the loot of 4 corners of the earth made into academic study and entertainment for the public. So this august institution, probably the most important museum on earth, has decided, after a process of working with researchers, that yes, Palestine actually is not a word that we want to use, and removed it from a whole number of, the parts of the museum. I just wondered what you think about that.
One more question, maybe, for this youngest in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Fiona Leach, a retired academic from the University of Sussex. I wanted to ask, a wonderful talk, thank you. I wanted to ask if you thought the genocide in Gaza was inevitable. It seems extraordinary that within 2 generations, we have a Holocaust in Europe over genocide or extermination of one people by another, to the victims of that Holocaust now being the perpetrators of another. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, first on David, thank you for the question or the point about terrorism. Yes and no, in the sense that yes, obviously it does the work that you're referring to demonize as virtually all sort of, as I said, all non-Western forms of resistance, going back to the Haitian Revolution, were demonized as barbaric or savage or terroristic, etc. Usually barbaric and savage, and then terrorism is a later designation to talk about the non-West. But remember that it's long before the Palestinians engaged in armed resistance in the 1930s, but then in the 1950s and 60s, already the question of anti-Semitism and the question of Zionism was already there, and that equation was already in place, hence what I talked about Balfour in the beginning. And remember, the British described the Jewish organizations, the paramilitaries that carried out the outrageous attacks in Palestine and end of Mandate Palestine as terrorists, Menachem Begin and others. That hasn't stigmatized their movement, in part because of what I'm talking about. So I think the issue with the Palestinians is not that they're just, quote, savage or non-Western. It's that they're also always implicated in this question of being anti-Semites. That is what is being mobilized, vastly more than the question of terrorism, in terms of the campaign of repression that we see. Maybe in Britain, with the Palestine Action, it's about terrorism, they're using the specific terrorism laws. But in the US, it's clearly the weaponization of claims of anti-Semitism that are used to destroy and shut down and crush protests. But I take your point. I think these can work together in some cases. In terms of the point about the Palestine Museum, the Palestine Museum. It should be called the Non-Western Museum. It should be called the Non-Western, yes. That's a decolonizing. Yeah. I've heard different, maybe you can, or you guys can educate me here about the true story of what happened at the British Museum, because they of course say, no, we're not removing the word Palestine, just in certain, but of course they're doing it in response, as you said, to yet another example of political mobilization that's all about denial and all about repressing. And the question is, as long as the political and balance as well as the interests of various these organizations and institutions. As long as they feel that their interests lie in placating these Zionist organizations, they're going to continue doing these kinds of things. But the question is, what's going to happen when this generation, which has seen what it's seen, in 10 years' time, they're in positions, and I think there is something is going to shift. The question is, how many Palestinians will be left in Palestine? This is the great race that's happening right now. And then that brings me to the question of the inevitable genocide. I think as you know, and as everyone knows, as I said in the talk, from an ignorance, as in the literal sort of not seeing of Palestinians in the early stages of the Zionist movement, to then the recognition that they constitute a problem, and then the idea that this problem has to be dealt with in some way and has to be removed. So 100% the idea of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And you could say, of course, the genocide, if you want to, in 1948, but really the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in 1948 certainly paves the way for the genocide in Gaza. The logic is there. The logic is that these people, the bodies have to be removed, pacified, tamed. Something has to be done to them. But I don't think in my wildest dreams, and maybe because I'm the failure in this sense, the failure of my imagination, I never imagined we'd live in an era when we'd see such extraordinary depravity in Gaza, so not just tolerated by the Western powers, Britain, the United States, France, and Germany, but actively supported. And then, of course, they're all acting now in this desperate attempt to cover up and deny and suppress. That's where we are.
Thank you. Any more questions? So one here, Sophie. And one here in the middle. Yes.
Nadia Aburdene. I was going to ask you, maybe this is not true, but I hear that most people now in the US support the Palestinian cause. First of all, you can answer if you think that's true or not. And secondly, if so, how's this going to, how will it manifest going forward?
Should I answer or no? Okay.
One more here, and Dave. Raise your hand so she can see.
Oh, sorry. You can go there. Thanks. Yeah, I guess I just had a question, not to diminish the optimism, but as much as there are obviously many people awakening in like so-called masses and not accepting this kind of 2 + 2 = 5, I feel like something I guess I'm finding very prevalent is the reverse, which is like the extreme violence, the acceptance of that violence, and the unabashedness of the public nature of that violence is also creating discourse here that is actually mainstream to be violent as well. And rather than hiding or denying, there's an openness and a pride about it. Like just a couple of years ago, we had Suella Braverman, who's in the cabinet at the time, which is as mainstream as you could get, I guess, defending the British Empire, defending British colonialism, and not just kind of rationalizing it or saying it was worse than it, better than it was or something, but actually saying it's something that we should be proud of. So I guess the question is kind of, what's like the reckoning with this kind of like how much is the depravity, Zionist depravity, also kind of making the West more depraved and forcing, like a lot of the time I don't see them denying videos, but maybe rationalizing it, saying they were Hamas fighters, for instance. Thank you.
Hello? Oh,
Yes.
yeah. Hi, my name is Mace, and I do a PhD at SOAS on Palestine and Germany, so I very much appreciated your references on Germany. But to be honest, I have a different question, which is the Arab complicity in the genocide, because I feel like we as Arabs very much focus on the Western discourses, which is important, but what about the Arab complicity in it also, if we think about the Gulf states right now? And maybe this could also be the bridge on Iran and the Gulf states and the US, maybe.
Thank you.
The first question, was it the cause question? Yeah. So the first question, who was the first question? I don't remember who asked the first question. Somebody. Oh, yeah, that's right. So the question about whether, yes, obviously the polls coming out in the US are unequivocal. There is a complete reverse in terms of sympathy for the Palestinians as opposed to Israel. That is clear. You can see that, and you can see this both among students and what we call progressive, or whatever you want to call them, Democrats, because they're usually polled as Democrats or Republicans. And you can see that on the right, or the conservative, you see a split, a very clear split, precisely because people with millions and millions and tens of millions of followers are speaking out on Palestine in ways that they never did before. I wouldn't say, however, that this is support for the Palestinian cause. I think there's a big thing, a big caveat, which is to say, on the one hand, there are people who sympathize with Palestinians as humanitarian victims. That's not the same thing as saying they support the Palestinian cause as in liberation. No. But the point is that there's been a shift, and the question is, what would happen if there wasn't this ferocious censorship war or war of repression that's taking place now, precisely because of the shift taking place? And that leads me to the second question, or the question about the pessimism. I can't remember thank you. The pessimism question, yes, of course, that you should be. I mean, the whole point is that it's an active, it's a struggle. And that's why I said Gaza is the crucible of our time and our age, precisely because if, in fact, those who advocate and justify the slaughter of Gaza predominate and win at a popular level, at an electoral level, whatever it is, then, of course, that spells, that's a catastrophe for the entire world. But what happens in Gaza, you can already see happening in other parts of the world, so there's no question. But on the other hand, I would say, and this is my naive optimism, it's not just naive optimism, it's actually a real belief in things. It's why I push back at the people who make these simplistic equations and say, you know, the US is a settler colonial society, Israel is a settler colonial, therefore there's equivalence. No, it's not true. The US today is not the US of the 18th century, or the 19th century, I should say. It's not the US, and Canada is not the same. And these societies have all changed in massive ways, and so has the UK, which is precisely why there is so much transformation in consciousness. So I think it's an important point to not to deny or dismiss the fact that there's racism and there's colonialism and there's settler colonialism in these societies, but these are not the same kinds of societies as they were. So I wouldn't call it the West. I mean, I sometimes use the West for shorthand, but it's really important to understand and recognize that there is an extraordinary differentiation and contradictions in Western societies, which is why there is so much repression, mostly that we see today in Western societies that support. So I think it's important, and it's not that everyone supports Palestine, but vastly more people today can see what is happening and have seen what has happened. That's not going to leave their consciousness. You cannot unsee a genocide. And I think we're going to see the effects down the road. I think it's a matter of time. Just think about this room. Think about each of you and all the relationships you have, all the people you know, and as you become and get into the job market, for those of you who are younger, I hope there is a job market, but insofar as there's a job market, that you end up, and just think about all those relations. Think about the networks of transformation. I mean, in the end, the Zionist movement didn't just start it started working its way up. It's a similar kind of process. And then in terms of Arab complicity, obviously, there is obviously, I answer this in two ways. Always remember the source. I think it's really important. The Arab states today are the way they are because they've been made this way. The Arabs fought and were crushed, quite frankly. They were fought, and the states. They were fought, and you could say, there are all these reasons why they fought. They were cynical, they fought half-heartedly, but in the end, Arab societies were mobilized to an extraordinary degree in the 20th century around the question of Palestine. That has been assault. There's been an assault, a systematic assault. And yet, despite that, go back to the World Cup, after decades of go back to the World Cup in Qatar and the Moroccan team. What flag were they flying, in addition to the Moroccan flag? The Palestinian flag. It's part of the consciousness of people. Now, again, here as a historian, I'm being maybe ahistorical, but I think there is something that's fundamentally deeply rooted. Again, states can do what they want, and they can be successful to a large extent in terms of suppressing, and Arab states are absolutely complicit. The UAE, among other states, are absolutely complicit in the genocide. It's clear. But virtually every Arab state is complicit. But in the end, I always remember that the reason for this is not just because the Arab states woke up one day and decided to. No, it's because of the fact that they are involved in one of the truly sort of last major colonial questions that is still in its sort of most aggressive form. That's what I would say.
So one here, Jeremy?
Here?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking. It's been really fantastic to listen to you. So I guess my question is around framing. I found it really interesting that you sort of repeatedly use the language of philo-Semitism and also of atonement, because I don't typically hear those words used in this context. And I'm just wondering if atonement, I'm wondering what you think about where it stops being atonement, or maybe never was, and starts being more about Jews and anti-Semitism as a vessel that perhaps functions more akin to homonationalism as opposed to, reparations or atonement for homophobia. And I'm just wondering what you think about sort of that framing and how it sort of changes the notion of power dynamics and also of intentionality of those actors who are perpetuating this in the name of Jewish liberation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
One more question here, Sophie.
First of all, thank you very much. This was incredible, and I think everyone here shares this opinion. So you spoke about the consciousness of the people, and when you were referring to the change amongst intellectuals about Palestine and the Palestinian cause, you mostly focused on what I would describe like the intellectuals of the people, so the communists, the socialists, the feminists, or basically the people in this room, the anti-racist. And I was wondering, what about elite intellectuals? And like if we think of the backlash, the censorship, and where it's coming from, the British Museum, British universities, there is a part of the intellectual world that is really connected to elite and that is supported by wealth class institutions. Have these changed, particularly in the UK?
Thank you. One more here. Maeve.
Hi, my name is Mona. Thank you very much for the lecture. You alluded to Iran earlier. I just wanted to follow up on that. I just wondered what your thoughts were on the US-Israel attack on Iran and where you think that leaves Zionism in its arc in history. And we've seen the same patterns of dehumanization and the narrative of Israel having the right to defend itself against Iran, obviously. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on this and where it sits in the history of Zionism. Thank you.
I'll take one more.
Sure.
One more here, Rajesh.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful lecture. My question is that you talked about the vote of India and Pakistan in UN. Now we see the visit of Indian Prime Minister to Israel and the complicity of India in the Gaza genocide. How do you see this as a phenomenon? Being it's a societal transformation that we are talking about, or is it something different?
Thank you. Do you want to answer these?
Okay, I'll try to remember. I think there were 4 questions. Let's see. The first question on the cynicism question that you asked, or sorry, the atonement. I said claims of atonement. I mean, but the whole point is, I think it's an extraordinarily cynical sort of enterprise. But I would say, insofar as people did not see, or would not see, or not allowed to see, depending on how which specific intellectual we're talking about, there's no question that for some of these people it was a genuine sense of atonement. But of course, and James Baldwin calls all this out in the 1960s and 1970s by calling this a cynical act of alleged atonement, precisely because he says they didn't care about Jews or about Palestinians. They just wanted to be rid of all of them. And Balfour himself says something similar, but I think Balfour has this kind of paternalistic sympathy for what he refers to as the Jewish people in a way that he has no sympathy. There's no expression of emotional or bond or connection, intellectual, ethical, imaginative, anyway, with the Palestinians. They're just not there. And I think it's what's more interesting is to see what happens when when they're confronted, when people are confronted over time with the absolutely undeniable nature of what is happening. That's why Gaza, the genocide is so extraordinary. Is that it's impossible to deny. And so that brings me to the question of the And it goes back to this question of to what extent is it cynicism? I think now it's become cynicism. Now, I mean, you're talking about the Western support, not so much about philo-Semitism. No, I'm not talking about Israelis and what they say and what they do. I'm talking about the extraordinary cynicism that is at the heart of so much of the refusal, because intellectually they can't argue anymore, ethically they can't argue, morally they can't argue. All they can do is repress and censor, but it's increasingly thin in terms of as an argument, which gets me to the elite institutions. And the question of elite institutions, I mean, it's a really important question because it's the same in the U.S. It's exactly the same in the U.S. When I'll give you just one example of because I can't speak for Britain because I don't know the British case as well, but you can educate me and tell me. But in the United States, for example, the American Historical Association, I happen to be now the president of the Middle East Studies Association, but a much larger organization is called the American Historical Association, which in 2022 condemned unequivocally and in record speed the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in 2007 condemned what happened in Iraq and said it is a moral duty among, something I'm paraphrasing here, but basically the American Historical Association, which really is elite, sort of, like in that sense, liberal elite sort of opinion, condemned the abuse of what happened in Iraq, and it said it's a moral duty of scholars and historians to actually be conscious and aware of what happens in the present, not just in the past. And so, and yet, when it came to the question of Palestine, the interesting thing is that the vast majority of the membership at the meetings condemned the scholasticide. And yet, the elite, sort of the leadership, I know you don't mean elite in terms of just leadership of these organizations, but they condemned, they vetoed, they wouldn't allow this. They wouldn't allow this, and what they hid behind, they said it's not settled history. In other words, there are people, which is true, there are people, which is precisely why you have to take a stand when there are people on both sides. What's the point of taking a stand after the fact? But yeah, elite institutions are the last to change. And the question is, what do again, we go back to this question of student protest in history, in the 20th century. Again, we may be in a different age. We may be in a completely different age, in which case everything I'm saying is sort of irrelevant, because we're all doomed by the fascists, both here and in other parts of the world. But the reality is that student movements typically are ahead. They're leaders. They typically address and raise questions and issues before the rest of society. And what happens over time is that the rest of society catches up, and then what became unthinkable becomes normalized. And I think that's what's happening with the question of the Palestinians. The problem, again, we go back to history, the problem in the West is that almost all the commemorations of, or the recognition of, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's slavery, whether it's the abuse of indigenous peoples around the world and the exploitation of indigenous peoples and colonialism, almost always happens long after the moment itself. And so the question then is what will happen? How much pressure can be put? And I don't know, because the whole point is that this is a live, ongoing issue. But as I said, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. And I think, and that's why I really do believe that there's a shift, a generational shift, the consequences of which we have yet to see. We're going to see it down the line, if the Palestinians can survive. Big if. I mean, on their land. I mean, on their the question of Iran. There was a question of Iran and the question of India. Iran. I mean, clearly, I mean, we can all see what's happening, and this is Nimer as a professor of law, and all the other professors of law. I don't understand. They used to tell us, they used to uphold this idea of, condemning the Russians because of the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and here we have a clearly unprovoked illegal war on Iran, and yet, of course, there's zero condemnation. As far as there are individuals, but certainly not states. And so what does it mean for Zionism? It depends, of course, ultimately on, since it's the first time in history that I'm aware of, that you have a joint US-Israeli assault on people in the Middle East. So up until throughout, and I wrote about this earlier today, but the reality is that in the 1950s and 1960s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the US position and policy through the end of the Cold War was the idea that we can both maintain our main interest in the Middle East from a US perspective, which is petroleum, and making sure that we dominate the petroleum order, and we structure it in a way that benefits the US and Western states. On the other hand, deny the Soviets. That was the other rationale. They didn't talk about democracy in any of the secret documents, but it was very clear what their interests were. And then the question of Israel would always come up in the secret documents. And the interesting thing is that US policymakers will always say, well, Israel is a problem for us because, of course, it's generating anti-American sentiment. And it was clear that, okay, so you have these two things. So how do we do both? We have to convince the Arabs that we're not on Israel's side always. We have to do this kind of double thing. And that maintained itself until the end of the Cold War. And then when the Cold War ended, and the beginning of the Clinton administration, all the way to where we are today, there's been a complete sort of, because of political power and so on and so forth, and donors and all that stuff, there's been a complete shift to where the US now is openly at war with Israel. It doesn't even pretend anymore. And so, of course, the answer then to your question is, what happens to the question of, it all depends on what happens on the ground. I don't know. I really don't. And the last question was about India. I mean, India, what a tragedy in the sense of a great history of anti-colonialism and a great history of in fact, Nehru and Gandhi and all these other figures who were profoundly anti-Zionist in the sense of understanding who were the natives and who was being oppressed in Palestine. Where we are today, of course, is a completely different story with Modi's visit to Israel. But the difference, and here's a little shred of maybe. I mean, it doesn't. I don't think it makes. It's terrible, both for Palestinians and, of course, for Muslims in India itself, or for anyone who opposes an authoritarian regime in India. But the reality is that, unlike the U.S., the question is what kind of cultural sort of. I mean, in the U.S., the amazing thing is the ability of creating this narrative that I sort of talked about throughout the talk. Anti-Semitism, Holocaust, atonement, Israel atonement, even as cynical as it is, was still a very powerful narrative. I don't think there's any such thing, as far as I'm aware, in India. That's not why they support for very sort of material, secular reasons, And so, let's see what happens. And yeah, that's it.
So let's take one more round of questions. So one here, and then 1, 2.
Thanks. Thank you for your talk. It was great to listen to. My question is about the relationship between liberal humanism and Christian Zionism, which you both touched on in your talk. And I found your characterization of the liberal endorsement of Zionism after World War II to reconstruct that humanist premise very compelling. And in a way, I thought it spoke to your own work on American Christian missionaries in the colonial past. But I wondered whether you would say that Christian Zionists in the American sense and the American context today are in any way part of that liberal humanist story, or whether this is actually something else. Thanks.
Hello, and thank you. Welcome to London, occupied London. Thank you for this very succinct, although very comprehensive account that you provided us with. You really covered a huge amount. I wanted to touch on 3 things. First of all, the correlation between the post-war humanism sort of rooted in this philo-Semitism in its current iteration. And I wanted to kind of like ask you to sort of talk about its relevance to the non-universality and applicability of human rights. So lots of human rights for some and no human rights for others. The other one, given the brazen lawlessness of the US-Israeli duo, with regard to Gaza, Venezuela, and currently Iran and Lebanon, I wanted to sort of like frame that within a more sort of geo-economic kind of perspective.
Where's Adam Haniya? Yeah.
Say again?
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think about 90% of Iranian oil is supplied to China. Venezuelan oil also is supplied to China. And they are both in, yuan as opposed to petrodollars. So is the American-Israeli current acts of aggression on all of those with regard to the Ben Gurion Canal and all of that not desperate attempts to reassert the dominance of the petrodollar and challenge the Belt and Road Initiative and possibly challenge the BRICS with Modi going to Israel? And we all know what Modi is doing in Kashmir.
Thank you very
and
much.
finally, the title of the book with
I need to take
Eleanor
another
Roosevelt.
question, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more there, Selma.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the extremely interesting talk. So my question is about the narrative that you're describing of the West's support for Israel as a form of alleged atonement for the Holocaust and a way of kind of proving the goodness, as it were, of the West. I want to understand to what extent you're saying that that's a cause of support for Israel as opposed to a means by which to justify support that would be given in any event. Because I often ask myself, if Israel had, I know it's almost impossible to do this thought experiment, but had it been imposed in a region that wasn't so strategically important for other reasons, like in Uganda or Argentina, would we be seeing this level of support? Would we even be seeing this narrative? So I'm just curious to understand better what you're saying is cause and effect here.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for those questions. The first, the Christian Zionism, liberal humanism. I'm forgetting who spoke. Oh yeah, thank you. I'm trying to remember the question. It was a good question, and the difference is I mean, if the question, I'm trying to now recapitulate. I'm sorry. It's Christian Zionists in general. First of all, there's two forms of Christian. There's the early Christian Zionists. In other words, the so-called Protestant theologians and all these other people in North America and then on the continent who were strongly supportive of this idea or were interested in the idea of revelation and the restoration of the Jews. But as I said, it's a complete abstraction for them, for the most part. They didn't know Jews for the most part, and it was all this question of, okay, how do you read the Old Testament, and where does it connect, and how does it fill, and what's going to happen, and when is the second coming, and so on and so forth. That I would not classify, I mean, you could classify it, I guess, as a form of liberal humanism, but it's not the kind of, it's not at all the discourse that came to be apparent in 1947, in 1948, which was about addressing an urgent secular humanitarian question of displaced persons in Europe. And I think what happens afterwards, and in terms of the missionaries themselves, if I remember your question about American missionaries in particular, what's interesting is that the vast majority of the missionaries who were actually on the ground, as far as I'm aware, in the Middle East, ended up, of course, precisely because they saw and they regarded and they were interacting with people, they tended to be far more skeptical of the so-called Christian Zionists for whom this region was entirely just an abstraction and a place that the Bible and prophecies in the Bible were to unfold. I think that's one really important thing. So it's important, again, not to confuse all Christians with the idea of Christian Zionism. Not that you were suggesting that. Then in terms of Christian Zionism today, what's interesting is that there is a split, again, among evangelical Christians. I won't call them Christian, among the Christian Zionists like Mike Huckabee, whom you may have seen recently, who's obscene. I mean, what he said was just literally like obscene at so many different levels. Theologically, in terms of what he said about Palestinians, his justification of killing, I mean, everything, and the incoherence of the position has been exposed. Now the question is, and he kept saying there are 80 million Christian Zionist evangelicals. There may be 80 million evangelicals, but there's also, as we can see, again, in the same polls that somebody was referring to earlier, there is a split there, again, among generational lines, as people come, again, to the confrontation in the context of a genocide. What are we doing? What is Christianity? What is the imperative of witness, and so on and so forth? So I think all this is beginning, I'm hoping, to shift. But then I get stuck on the question. I want to go to the last question first about the question of witness as opposed to justification. Then I'll come back to the Iranian oil question and the human rights question. The question of the justification, that's a really good question, and we debate this all the time. There's always this debate. There's an endless debate. And I have this debate endlessly with my colleagues, especially my colleagues who are brilliant I don't want to say words, but brilliant historians and brilliant scholars and brilliant sort of political economists and so on, who emphasize always the material aspects of this, the question of resources, the question of, but then you go back to the historical evidence itself, and you go read the archives, and you think, okay, why did the US do what it did in 1947? When Balfour says what he says, does he bring up the whole question of the resources of Palestine or the region? No. I mean, the interesting thing is the debates are there. You can go read the debates and see what they say and how they say it and how they justify it. Unless we're willing to say that they were engaged in this elaborate false consciousness and they really wanted when they wanted the material resource, they would say it very clearly. And when they didn't want it, they would say something else. I think it's important to take culture in this sense seriously and a set of representations and beliefs and ideology very seriously, just as you take, of course, the resources. We know that the US is interested in Iran in part, of course, because of oil, but also in part because of the fact that it resists and opposes. And there's a whole sort of discourse in a demonization of Iran going back to the Iranian Revolution. And so I think both are at work. I don't think it's one or the other always, but I think it's quite clear that in the key moments, when you go back to, for example, if Israel is the great weapon and the shield of the United States because of resources, well then, the question I always ask, and maybe Adam and others here will have a brilliant answer that I haven't thought of, or just a good answer that I haven't thought of, which is when the US, because the US has always identified petroleum and the control of petroleum resources in the Middle East as its key interest in the 20th century, when those were actually threatened, both in 1979 in their perception threatened, in 1979 with the revolution, and then with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, guess what the US did? It didn't turn to Israel. It said, you stay aside. We're going to go deal with this, with our fleets and our armies and our navies and all that stuff. And so I think it's important that you go back to 47, the CIA, Secretary of State George Marshall, the State Department, they were all like saying, what's in it for us? They all said it. What's in it for us? And Truman had domestic advisors who basically said, this is what's in it for you. The record is crystal clear on these things in some moments. And I think we have to take those seriously. So in terms of the Iranian oil and the 90% going to China, and is this, it may well be, I don't know who asked me that question. Yes, it may indeed well be that, but of course, I'm not sure if I understood the question. If the question is the US interested in this because of this? Very possibly. Yes, I'm absolutely, I mean, again, this is way beyond my realm. There's people here who are much more qualified than me to speak about this, but it's quite clear that the US is certainly not doing this for human rights in Iran. That much everyone knows. We all know that for a fact. Sorry? No, I understand, but I'm saying, but just to answer your question, so, I mean, there may be many motives, and again, we're going to find out soon enough what those motives are, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if it's a combination of several different factors, including intense lobbying by neoconservatives and by Benjamin Netanyahu and others who have been pushing for this war for decades at this point. And then there was a question about post-war humanism. I don't remember. Was there another question, or that's it?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you a question at the end. So I'm going to go back to your narrative, the narrative you constructed about the Jewish question, to the Palestine question, to the atonement. How do you see the last couple of years, one of the striking phenomena is the alliance between Zionism and the far right in Europe, the xenophobic anti-immigrant right, in which they constructed a story that all these immigrants, the Arabs and the Muslims coming to Europe, they are the ones who are bringing anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism is not endogenous to Europe, it's something imported by, so it becomes a kind of a double attack, both against these pro-Palestinian Muslims and Arabs who are in Europe, and xenophobic anti-immigration sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just said it perfectly. It's exact. I would add it to the story that I'm saying. You could add that very chapter to the story I'm saying. But the disingenuousness, the sheer outright fraudulence of that kind of argument is so obvious and apparent. But again, why they're saying it is precisely because it's meaningful. It's culturally relevant, which is, again, if you go back to, so I don't dismiss that at all, but it's a question, again, we go back to this question of cynicism, but also an awareness of what are culturally available vocabularies that have to be mobilized and used to be able to justify a certain kind of position. What's interesting on the right in the United States, or the conservatives, whatever you want to call it, it's so interesting to watch people who have been sort of, in a sense, schooled, if that's the right word,
into the whole sort of, they're aware because of this whole thing I've been talking about sort of the history of, not so much the history of anti-Semitism, but understanding that you cannot be overtly anti-Semitic. It's very difficult to be overtly anti-Semitic in the real sense, not the sense of being anti-Zionist, but in the sense of being anti-Jewish. And what's really interesting to see is how many of these people are aware of that discourse and are still now have created this space, this criticism of Israel and Zionism on the discourse of America first. And at the same time saying of course, they're totally opposed to anti-Semitism. And so there's something shifting, and that's on the conservative side, as I said, and that's a really interesting phenomenon that I'm not really that equipped to know, but it's fascinating to see what is happening. I mean, there is a change taking place before our eyes. Will it matter? Well, that depends if any of us matter in terms of voting and democracy and all these things.
Well, let's hope it does matter.
Yeah.
I would like to thank Eddie for your support and leadership. I would like to thank everyone who helped in organizing this event, Nate George, Sophie, Maeve, and the others in the Center of Palestine Studies. There are flyers for the SOAS Palestine Studies book series that is edited by Professor Adam Hani and Professor Dina Matar. We have published around 21 books in the last 8 years, so please check it out. And mostly, I would like to thank all of you for being here and to Professor Ussama Makdisi for this enlightening talk. Thank you so much.